Yeah, okay. Let me find my thing. Okay. Um, we're here today to discuss a critical issue that demands our immediate attention, the prioritization of adaptation to climate change over mitigation. In the face of our changing climate, it is imperative that we reassess our priorities and adopt a pragmatic approach that places adaptation at the forefront of our efforts. Today, I'll be talking to you about three things: immediate impact, economic stability, and social justice. In my, when I talk about immediate impact, I want to talk about the effects of climate change and how they're already here. They're affecting vulnerable communities and ecosystems, and by prioritizing adaptation, we can address the immediate challenges faced by these communities and build up resilience for these communities to withstand these impacts. And economic stability makes us invest in adaptation measures that can enhance economic stability and protect our critical infrastructure, agricultural systems, and coastal regions. The cost of adapting the cost of adapting to climate change is often lower than the long-term economic consequence of inaction. And lastly, I will also be talking about social justice. Vulnerable communities, often the least responsible for climate change, bear the brunt of its impacts. And to prioritize adaptation allows us to address social justice issues and allows us to ensure that the most effective populations receive the support and resources that they need to adapt and thrive. While fighting climate change remains a critical long-term goal, prioritizing adaptation is a pragmatic and urgent necessity. By focusing on adaptation, we can protect our communities, strengthen our economy, and address social inequities. We can also position the US as a global leader responding to these challenges in a changing climate. Because of the US's strong impact on other global regions, if the US acts, others may follow in suit. So it's time for us to act decisively, invest wisely, and build a resilient future for generations to come. And that's kind of all I got. That was like my last speech.
Okay, I have a few questions for you. How might addressing climate change contribute to the resilience and adaptability of communities, particularly those most vulnerable to its impact?
Those communities don't really have the time to wait for mitigation strategies to occur. So by prioritizing adaptation, we can quickly attack these issues so that they're not suffering for a longer amount of time like they would be have had we prioritized mitigation.
Okay, and then one last question. In what ways could transitioning to sustainable practices lead to improvement in public health and overall well-being?
I think that changing our strategies could lead to temporary betterment of our public health. I do think mitigation strategies should still be kept going, but they just shouldn't be prioritized as opposed to adaptation.
Okay, that's all I've got.
Thank
Okay, I think I'm up next. So today, me and my team will be arguing why the US should not prioritize adaptation to climate change. Making our world a worse place by producing overwhelming infrastructures and changing to the world is simply just not okay. There are other effective ways to help the planet. Um, so moving to my first point, its impact on vulnerable communities. So the Environmental Protection Agency notes that low income communities and communities of color are disproportionately affected by climate change, facing higher exposure to environmental hazards and less access to resources for adaptation. So without mitigation efforts, these communities will continue to bear the brunt of climate related disasters. Um, Environmental de- degradation can lead to various environmental issues such as rising temperatures, sea levels rising, extreme weather events, loss of biodiversity, and disruption of ecosystems. These changes can have detrimental effects on habitats, wildlife, and natural resources. Another point is social inequity. Climate change often exists existing social inequities by disproportionately affecting marginalized communities who have fewer resources to adapt and recover from its impact. This can lead to increased social tensions and conflict over scarce resources. And then moving to my next point is agricultural challenges. The US Department of Agriculture highlights that climate change disrupts agricultural patterns, leading to reduced crop yields and increased food insecurities. For example, in 2020, extreme weather events caused significant loss for farmers across the country, with estimated crop damage totaling $43 billion. So prioritizing adaptation without mitigation would further strain agricultural resilience. And changing growing conditions, which is shifting in temperature and precipitation patterns, alter the growing condition for crops. Some regions may experience more frequent or intense droughts, while others face increased rainfall or flooding. These changes can disrupt traditional planting schedules and crops cycles, which leads to reducing yields and lower quality production. And then another point off of that also is water scarcity. Changing in precipitation patterns and increased evaporation rates can lead to water scarcity, particularly in regions already prone to droughts. And then my last point off of that is pests and diseases. Warmer temperatures and changing weather patterns can create favorable conditions for pests and diseases to thrive. So these species may expand their range into new areas, damaging crops and reducing yields. So higher temperatures can accelerate the development and spread the plant diseases and threaten the agricultural productivity. And then my last point is the economic impact. So according to the National Climate Assessment, the annual cost of damage from climate change in the US could reach hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century if emissions continue. In total, extreme weather events cost the US about $150 billion per year due to direct impacts such as infrastructure damage, worker injuries, and agricultural losses, and as the author reports. So adaptation costs, so implementing adaptation measures to cope with climate change, such as installing irrigation systems, switching to drought resilient crop varieties, or investing in climate resilient infrastructures can be costly for farmers, especially those in small communities with limited financial resources. So the lack of access to credit and support further hinders farmers' ability to adapt to changing conditions. In conclusion, impact on vulnerable communities, agricultural challenges, and economic impact are very important. So embracing the fight against climate change isn't an option. It's important for the US to fulfill this obligation and secure a sustainable future for generations to come. Thank you.
I think I only have one question for you on cross, but how would you think our agricultural how do you think our agricultural fields and our and all of our farms would be able to last long enough for mitigation strategies to finally take place?
Sorry. I think as long as we're still developing new resources, we can still keep our farming and agricultural still alive. And I think that once we produce these products, we will further advance, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Then that's all for me.
Perfect.
Okay. Did you want to just reread your statement, or should we just skip that and then I'll just start reading mine?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. What is climate change? According to the United Nations, uh, according to the United Nations, climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions. And what contributes to climate change? Well, the answer is quite obvious. Humans. Everything we use, everything we build, and everything we eat all contributes to climate change. In today's discussion, we'll explore why it's crucial to focus on fighting climate change rather than just dealing with its aftermath. The first component would be social justice. In 2019, the richest 1% were responsible for 16% of global carbon emissions. This is the same amount of emissions as the poorest 66% of humanity, around 5 billion people. This is a quote from an article called Climate Equality, A Planet for the 99%, written by Oxfam in November 2023. In this article, they largely talk about how the rich get to live such lavish lives by emitting excess amounts of carbon. Their short trip on their private jet can produce more oxygen than the average person emits all year. This data just shows how unconcerned they are for our Earth. With their private jets, they don't just take one trip a year, they are likely to take many trips a month, which adds up in the end and creates more carbon emissions. If we adapt to climate change, we are simply allowing the rich to make more and more unnecessary carbon emissions, while we, the other 99%, have to work towards their doings and adapt. If we limit their ability to be able to use their private jet or even tax the rich, we are able to move towards fighting climate change. Oxfam states a tax of 60% on the incomes of the super rich 1% of earners globally would cut the carbon equivalent of more than the total emissions of the UK and raise 6.4 trillion US dollars to fund renewable energy and transition away from fossil fuels. This data just shows how taxing the rich would have a big impact on carbon emissions as it cuts out the carbon equivalent of a whole country, 67.3 million people. And this excess tax could also be used towards funding renewable energy, which will move us away from the traditional fossil fuels. Adaptation is not a very good solution when facing climate change because it is just not efficient. In the documentary called Before the Flood by National Geographic, they show us a part of the world who tried adapting to climate change, Miami Beach, Florida. Miami Beach had a problem called sunny day flooding, where it would be a sunny day in Florida, but water would arise from the pipes and drains, causing Miami Beach to start flooding. In order to combat this, the mayor, Philip Levine, tried to prevent flooding by integrating pumps into their city and raising roads that were most compacted by the flood. This whole project was a $400 million project that was largely funded by raising taxes. But when Levine was asked about how long this would prevent flooding, he said that it would only last 40 to 50 years, and after that, they would have to come up with a new solution. This alone is just not efficient, as you would have to rebuild and rebuild after every 50 something years, and this process just gets more and more expensive. Ultimately, at some point, there's a limit where you just cannot build on top of the roads anymore. In conclusion, as we embark on the exploration of the urgent need to combat climate change, it is evident that the Earth is undergoing long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. While adaptation is essential, it addresses the symptoms and not the root cause. We find ourselves at a pivotal moment where the choices we can make shape the future of our planet. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, so if you say that adaptation isn't really like doing much for our planet and it's only addressing the symptoms, does that mean that you want to cut all adaptation strategies out?
Um, Not necessarily. Our prompt for this debate is like why we should prioritize climate change over adaptation. So it's not completely cutting out adaptation, but it's just not like fully prioritizing adaptation over climate change.
Okay, and if we're focusing more on mitigation topics and prioritizing adaptation less, how do you think the planet would be able to handle that, if that makes any sense?
What do you mean?
Are
Or
there any
like,
other, policies or things you'd want to put in place to kind of make it easier for us to prioritize mitigation?
Well, one of the ones I went over in would be like um limiting the rich in their like uses of private jets because they create so much carbon emissions that um developing countries have to pay for even though they didn't create the carbon emissions. So one of them would just be like limiting carbon emission from the rich. We could also like change to um, cleaner energies, so like electric cars and whatnot. Just like moving away from like fossil fuels and things that create carbon emissions.
Okay, yeah, that was it.
Okay.
And then for this last part, do you know which teammate of yours like does the rebuttal? Was it you or was it your partner?
It was her, but I'll just figure something out.
You can just like restate like we were saying earlier or something like that because it's yeah, it's fine. You don't have to go too much on that.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. And I go right now for rebuttal?
I guess yeah, whenever you're ready. I mean, we usually do like a little group huddle thing, but
Yeah, yeah.
if you want to go
Go
two
feel free.
minutes, we can kind of just go 2 minutes for just like mute. Just let us know.
Yeah. I'll like give me like 2 seconds. I'll like fix my thing up a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I think I'm ready. Today I talked a lot about how adaptation is a response to the urgent consequences of climate change that we are already facing. There are extreme weather events, rising sea levels, disruptions to our agriculture, and all of these are not distant threats. They're happening right now. By prioritizing adaptation, we can strengthen our communities against these immediate impacts and ensure the safety and well-being of our citizens. The economic ability at stake should be considered. Natural disasters and climate-related events have severe economic repercussions. By prioritizing adaptation measures, we are investing in resilient infrastructure, safeguarding businesses, and protecting jobs. So by proactively adapting to the changing climate, we can mitigate the financial toll that these events impose on our economy. And to prioritize adaptation also aligns with a lot of social justice principles. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities and makes existing inequalities even larger. By focusing on adaptation, we can ensure that our policies address the needs of those who are most affected, and that this approach fosters equity and inclusivity, protecting marginalized communities from the adverse effects of climate change, while also promoting social justice on a broader scale. Adapting to climate change is a pragmatic and effective approach that responds to immediate challenges, promotes economic stability, and upholds the principles of social justice. to make this shift, the United States can build a more resilient and equitable future for all its citizens. You guys have talked a lot about how, as even though adaptation is our strategies that should be implemented, mitigation should be prioritized due to its immediate, mitigation should be prioritized due to the fact that it's solving a problem and not just pushing a problem back. But at this time, we don't really have the choice to wait for things to get better. We have to act now because our planet is struggling and it has been for a really long time. So it we should prioritize adaptation as a vital component of our climate strategy to safeguard our nation against the impacts that are already occurring. Thank you.
All right, for sure. And then I'll just give me like 2 minutes, 1 minute to kind of gather my points together.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay, so I'll start. So yeah, you mentioned a little bit about the kind of the economy and a little bit like that side of the of adaptation and how to prioritize that. Unfortunately, I don't have enough rebuttal for the economic part of that. You did mention a little bit of the of prioritizing, putting that emphasis on the struggle, like people that are affected the most, basically, and people who can't support them, like such as countries that are struggling financially. I think that like one thing that I gathered in terms of that I would like to kind of point out is this thing called the Glasgow Climate Pact, I believe, which is literally just a an effort agreed by many countries to just put their finances towards developing countries because they know that they can't obviously support their situation the best currently. So that's just one thing that I think like is being helped right now, and I think like uh in terms of like the urgency and how you were saying how adaptation is more of a urgent sense of urgency rather than mitigation, which was kind of we're not acting right now and kind of thinking more in the long term. It's a valid point, but I think that there are uh, points from both sides that do have that sense of urgency as well, and how we are realizing that there isn't much time to wait, especially for our case in mitigation where we can't wait. And ours is more of like it's not adaptation. We're kind of going for like a full reversal or a full stoppage of climate change. But with that being said, I want to include some points of my own, and also kind of taking a little bit of points from my previous debates, and kind of just reiterate those points because I think that those are very important when it comes to the idea of mitigation. Starting with, well, I'll just kind of start with my introduction here. Meaning that the planet may seem to be far beyond repair because of how rapid and extreme our changes in weather have been, but just know that instead of backing down and doing I don't want to say bare minimum, but just doing things like adaptation, we still have the power to turn this around and mitigate. My team and I are going to discuss or have discussed why mitigating climate change is our best bet at fighting global warming because of how it is the best chance at getting us further along as a healthy world. With the technology and influence we have over basic human habits, the capabilities to become sustainable are within reach, and we must aim high for these goals so in the future, adaptation is less of a chore. With that being said, the mitigation of climate change isn't an easy task. and it will take tedious work to succeed. This can be seen in the many articles elaborated on, well, I'm not going to actually say some of the quotes, some of them are really long. But one thing that was really interesting to me was in an article here, they showed that population and climate change have like complementary growth. For small context, the world had a population of around 800 million in like the late 1760s, and with the Industrial Revolution started, and then started hitting the billions in the 1800s. Then fast forward to 5 to 6 billions in the 1980s. So you can tell that because of climate change, or because of population growth, climate change also started to increase. So I think that in terms of mitigation, we're seeing that these go hand in hand. If we kind of take care of population control, and that's kind of a different topic, obviously, because it's not exactly what we're used to in terms of taking care of the climate change or global warming, but kind of like putting those focuses on different countries and funding different different I don't know what it would be exactly, but whoever's kind of expertise is on put on population control, kind of putting those focuses towards them, they'd be able to kind of slowly over time make those changes. And I think that like because of this complementary growth, we'd see that that the decrease in population would also kind of translate into a decrease in climate change. And that's not to say that it would reverse it, because I think that we know that or climate change is also kind of like a little bit far beyond repair in terms of like where we're at on it. But I think that it shows that it'll slow it down by a whole lot. And then also just pushing the idea of nature-based forms of solutions, using up or upping the use of recycling of clean and renewable energy, collecting rain on a more local and personal level, creating reliable streams and irrigation systems, and lessening poverty. I think these are all just like smaller things that we don't exactly talk about enough when it comes to climate change. And I think that it also is important to note that we should be starting kind of smaller. And I think I kind of used this point to for adaptation as well a while ago. But I think that it helps as well for the case of mitigation, because mitigation is a very large, it's a much bigger goal, and the kind of it seems kind of like a higher bar to reach. But I think for mitigation, we have no choice but to start smaller. And I think with things such as, lessening poverty, or kind of using recycling and clean renewable energy, we would have to implement those things kind of just like in smaller areas, so that places, obviously, which can't be supported by doing such huge acts that are very expensive and take a lot of time. That would be like the smartest way to implement that in those areas. And to my conclusion, I would just say the common consensus is that humans are the root issue when it comes to global warming, and because of this, there are many behaviors that we have which can be changed over time, so that all aspects can build and come together to be considered mitigation. And overall, the behaviors of people are hard to change, and we would need a drastic amount of efforts from everyone to reverse and fix climate change. However, it does take one person at a time, and the truth is every little thing matters, which is kind of just like the general point of what mitigation really is. Again, it is obviously very unrealistic to think that like everybody is going to be the one pitching in and like around the world to help reverse climate change. So that isn't kind of what we're expecting, but rather kind of just like starting smaller and just doing every little thing that we can possible. Again, like I said, with the population control thing as well. I know it's not a very common point you hear, but I think people would be surprised how much it would have on the effect of climate change. And yeah, those are all my points.
Sounds good.
I believe we're all done. I'm gonna end the recording.
Yeah.
Okay.